All right, sorry for the interruption, people, but this dog needed to go out and she was being kind of a jerk about it. So this is Cookie Monster, one of the show sponsors. So I'll give her a treat.
Hey, Cookie.
You're not gonna subscribe to my dad's podcast. You're not gonna subscribe to my dad's podcasts.
All right, go upstairs, Cookie. Go. All right, so where were we?
Okay, so I guess just for one more piece of background to set the foundation for where we're gonna go. The business model today has changed, I'd say, over like the last decade or so. So, going back to the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you had to have fans. You had to have fans attend in the arenas. You had to have fans buy pay-per-views. And part of the reason Vince has been able to have this situation where he's just in a hostile relationship with the fans is because at this point, he really doesn't need them. He's a WWE is a content provider for, I'd say, their business partners. The vast majority of WWE's income, and they're hugely profitable today. And it has nothing to do with how many people are watching or don't watch or enjoy their shows. Their money comes from their media rights, which is SmackDown airs on Fox on Friday night. And I think it's like 200 million a year for SmackDown from Fox. And then USA has Raw, which they've had for a long time. NBCU also has the rights to the WWE Network, which is now on Peacock. So WWE's money, whether they're succeeding in satisfying fans, is almost irrelevant. I'd say it is irrelevant to the bottom line. Their money is baked in, their profits are baked in through these media rights deals. And finally, also another big one, and it's also relevant here, is the deal with Saudi Arabia, which is paying them $50 million a show for 2 shows a year. They're overpaying because WWE is propagandizing on their behalf. But so that's really where the money's coming from. It's not coming from their fans. It's coming from the content they provide to their partners. So when Vince announces that he wants to come back, and in fact, he does come back in January, it was just a few days ago, January 2022, Vince elects himself back on the board, along with 2 of his cronies, Michelle Wilson and George Barrios, who he fired 3 years ago. I think with hindsight, we could say, we know it was because they had differences over the future of the WWE Network. And I think it's because Vince wanted to sell it to Peacock, which he since did. And Barrios and Wilson were gone. He brings them back, puts them on the board, removes 3 members of the board. 2 other members resign, including the member of the board who was leading the investigation into Vince's charges. I should also point out that before Vince made this move, he sent a letter to the board saying he wanted to do it. The board unanimously rejected it. That includes, Stephanie was on it, Triple H was on it. They all rejected it. They asked him, they said, please. One, they asked him whether he was going to repay the expenses related to the investigation. And 2, they said, if you're going to insist on coming back, because he is the majority shareholder, he's got the majority voting power. If you're going to come back, wait until the end of the government investigations. Vince responds to the board. He says, you know what? Yeah, I will pay the reasonable expenses that aren't covered by insurance, but I'm not going to wait to come back. And he says he's coming back on this SEC filing. He says he's coming back to oversee a sale of the company and the media rights deals, which will be coming up. Another thing he also said to the board is that if he doesn't come back, he's going to refuse any sale or any media rights deal. All right.
All right, sorry about that. Technical issues with the dog.
She's coming back again.
God damn it. Of course she is. All right, so he came back, he got himself appointed to the board, and
He
we should
appointed
say that,
himself to the board.
what was that?
He appointed himself to the board and his two cronies, Barrios and Wilson. And like I said, you were walking away at this point. One thing he had told the board was that he was going to refuse to give his assent to any sale or any media rights deal unless he comes back. So with those circumstances, he brings himself back and he's once again makes himself the executive chairman. Stephanie, his daughter, announces her resignation 2 days ago. She, and again, it's couched in Vince, the founder, has returned. I've had a great time doing this. I'm going to chair him from the distance. But she didn't just take a leave now. Now she's actually resigned. So I think we can infer that she wasn't thrilled he returned.
Yeah, so
So
I don't know if he said he would block any deal with regard to the broadcast stuff. I don't know if he has the power to do that, because if he's not on the board, he's just a shareholder. I don't get to vote on whether Amazon decides to open up a cloud business or do it. I don't get a vote on that. And if you're on the board, sure, you're allowed to vote on takeovers and things like that. But as a shareholder, you're not allowed to do that. So I don't know if this was just a bluff, but he did come back to the board because he's an 81% voting shareholder. And now he announced that he wants to sell the company. So if he was an outsider, there's no duty exists as a shareholder towards other shareholders. But now that he's on the board, even though he's got a majority voting interest, he has to take into account the other shareholders, because now he's got a fiduciary duty to the other shareholders as well.
yes. So actually what ended up happening after all this was a rumor that we brought up earlier, which was the rumor that Saudi Arabia was going to buy the company. They were going to go private again. And Vince would be left in charge. So I think a lot of the speculation here is that Vince only will sell to a buyer that will leave him in charge. So one question I have for you then, with his fiduciary duty, is can he do that? I mean, obviously he can't at a certain level. He can't reject a great offer that would oust him, or else he'd be breaching his fiduciary duty now that he's once again on the board and the chair of the board. And one other question related to that, with let's say a Saudi Arabia purchase, how do you take into account the morality in an analysis, or do you, when it comes to shareholder value? Let's say Saudi Arabia is willing to pay twice right now, and we should also point out the stock rose in anticipation of a sale. Right now, I think the company's valued, probably overvalued, at like $6.5 billion. Let's say Saudi Arabia says we're going to pay $10 billion. Wow. But it's Saudi Arabia. How is that evaluated in a legal analysis?
So, I mean, when he votes his own interest as a shareholder, he doesn't have to take into account anyone else's interests. But when he strikes a deal that he gets a different outcome than other shareholders, for example, he still stays employed there, he's getting a part of the new deal, then that's a different story. Okay. And we should say that WWE has a very weird share structure. So it's very unusual, but sometimes you'll see with a company like Facebook or a company like Viacom that they have these 2 shares of stock, and one is like a super voting share. So Google has this as well. So people were not happy that Mark Zuckerberg was spending all this money on the metaverse, but his shares carry more votes than other people's shares. So even though, I might have 100 shares and you have 100 shares, you get 100 votes, I get 10,000 votes, right? It's that way. So Mark Zuckerberg, no one can oust him from Facebook. The 2 Google guys, no one can oust them from Google. And even though Vince has something like 20% of the equity in WWE, he has 81% of the voting control. So if as a shareholder who needs to approve a sale, if they offer him way too much money, he can still say no, right? And if he wasn't a majority shareholder, if he was just a board person, different standards apply. So if you didn't want to sell the company, during the 80s, there was this big wave of corporate takeovers.
So can I interrupt you for, so his threat actually was valid initially. His threat to the board saying, I'm not going to approve a sale, since he does have the majority of the voting shares, his approval would be needed for a sale.
For a sale, yeah.
Yeah. So he could, but you're questioning whether he would have to approve the media rights deals.
Right. I don't think he would.
Maybe they've structured it so he would have to. I mean,
I'd have to see what his shares say, but like it's a very unusual thing because not only does he get super voting rights with his shares, there's other people that have those shares, like his wife and his daughter and his son-in-law, Triple H. But when
not
they
his
sell
son, not his son. You should just point out and just Shane at one time really tried to blackmail him, but continue, please.
But his son-in-law, but if they sell their shares, then those don't become super voting shares. So it's a really weird thing. If they sell their shares to you, then they just become regular shares. They lose all their
because
magic.
they're not going to lose control in that fashion.
Right. So I mean, the only way he would lose control is if he sold his shares, which is not going to happen. And as I said, so if the company is for sale, there's it's a Delaware corporation, and Delaware has rules and case law about this. But generally, if you don't want to sell, you've got a lot more leeway. So for instance, at some point, Amazon was down to $1 a share, like after the 2000 market crash. And if somebody came and said, we'll offer you $2 a share, and Jeff Bezos said, no, because I think this has a real future, and we're going to build it our way, we're going to turn down this offer, you can do that, because you're exercising some control, and you're favoring long-term shareholders over short-term shareholders, and you can do things that are not just maximizing the most you can make for your shareholders. Like Starbucks used to pay for medical insurance for part-time workers, and the shareholders hated that, but he said, I am concerned about the environment and my workers and everything. So if you're running the company, you can take into account things besides just the shareholders. But once you've said this company's for sale, under Delaware, the law that's known as it's in play. And when that happens, if you say this company's for sale, you have to get the highest possible price. You can't take into account anything but your shareholders. So the famous,
price, could you take into account Saudi Arabia being a repressive regime that you
if they offer the most money, he couldn't take that into account.
Wow.
Because the famous case, there was a case called Revlon, which is the most famous one. It was in the 80s during the big takeover boom. And Revlon, I guess, used to be a nicer brand than it is now. And a famous takeover artist, Ron Perlman, wanted to buy the company because he had deals with Walmart, and he wanted to get Revlon into Walmart. And these French people who owned Revlon were horrified. They're like, no, we'd never do that. And they didn't want to sell to him, but he started buying shares, and then he initiated a hostile takeover. He wanted the shareholders to vote on it, and they sought out another buyer, what they call in the 80s a white knight. So they said, we won't sell to him, but we'll sell to this guy. And this guy had offered a good price, and then this corporate raider topped it. But the deal that was not the winning bid that the Revlon people wanted to sell to, the friendly acquirer, they said, we're going to take care of your bondholders. We're going to make sure the bonds trade at par. We're not going to fire anyone on the board. We're going to run things, we're going to leave you in charge. And Revlon, sorry, not Revlon. I think his name was Perlman. Yeah, he offered more money, but, he would have to issue junk bonds. He was going to tank the some of the existing debt, so it would trade for less than par. But he was giving more money to the shareholders, and the Delaware court said, if you want to run the company and not sell it, you can take into account the bondholders and your employees and the environment and whatever else you want. But once it's in play, once you're selling, The only thing you can take into account is the most dollar amount. So like if you were going to buy a house, somebody says, I'll give you a little bit less, but I can guarantee close, or I'll let you live in the house for a month or whatever. But in a corporate situation, if it's for sale, the highest price only. You don't have to sell, but once you decide to sell, your company's in play. For all your shareholders, you have to get the maximum dollar amount.
So now that Vince has put himself back on the board, let's say Netflix, just to pick a potential buyer. Netflix makes the highest offer, but they're like, no, Vince, you're out. We don't want you in there. If he rejects that, he puts himself at serious legal risk of a breach of fiduciary duty at that point.
Right.
Right.
And if they tried to buy the company and he was just a shareholder, he can reject it all he wants. But like
now
once
he's
on
got
the
the
board,
fiduciary duty.
yeah, you've got a fiduciary
One
duty.
other question on the SEC filing for his return, he said it's to oversee the sale or the media rights deal. Is there anything legally binding in that? Like, let's say he were to, without a sale, take over business ends, or take over, again, the concern, take over the creative product, where again, this guy who's got all these serious, incredible allegations relating to impropriety with women would be making hiring and firing decisions relating to women wrestlers, deciding who gets pushed, etc. Is he limited legally based on the SEC filing in what he can do in the company?
I don't think that limits him in any way. I think if you are announcing your intention, it's because you're going to trigger other things, like you don't want people inside the company buying or selling based on things they know that the public doesn't. And so, if you said, I'm here to sell the company, like people can do whatever they want because all that information is public now. No one has an edge. And also you're kind of inviting people to bid, right? So that's something that you would want to happen. You say the company's for sale. Now you're inviting bidders, and this Revlon standard kicks in where you have to get the highest price for your shareholders. Because as a shareholder, you're just beholden to yourself. But once you're on the board, you have these fiduciary duties, and there's two of them: the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, right? So the duty of care would be implicated if you weren't selling the company and then you decided to do these deals with the Saudis who had just murdered a journalist, and they want some better PR, but that might hurt your brand, like that might be implicated. But the duty of loyalty comes in when you're doing double dealing or things like that. And I don't know if you ever took corporations in law school with
I did. I didn't like it. This is the one class I didn't like that much in law school, really.
Well, the first case that everyone reads in corporations, or one of the first ones, is that Salmon versus Meinhard with Justice Cardozo, where he talks about the fiduciary duty.
I actually vaguely recall. I mean, we're going back 25 years or so.
Yeah,
I remember. Yeah.
So Cardozo, for those of you who don't know, eventually became a Supreme Court justice, but when he was a judge on the New York highest court, he issued this ruling, and it's the most famous case dealing with fiduciary duties. And hold on, let me pause 1 second because the dog is
Definitely.
Salmon versus Meinhard, famous case, and Justice Cardozo, who eventually was on the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, wrote many famous cases. He was known for being a really good writer as well as a jurist. But in this case, I remember having to look up the word because I'd never heard the word punctilio. He said, a fiduciary duty is the punctilio of honor, the most sensitive.
Oh my God, I remember all this now.
Yeah. So Salmon versus Meinhard, and I'll just tell you the facts of the case, because what happened after the case is even more interesting than the case. But a guy went into a partnership with his friend, and this guy had the money, Meinhard, and Salmon said, okay, you buy this building, I'll manage it for you, and then we'll split the money 50-50. You put up all the money, I'll do all the labor, we'll split it 50-50, right? Everything's fine. Then when the lease was almost up, the person who owned the building said, I actually own the whole block and we don't want to rent you this building again. We're just not going to renew the lease. And Salmon said, well, why don't you lease me the whole block and I'll run it, and then, I'll just lease the entire block from you. And the landlord said, sure. And then they signed an agreement. And then his original partner said, no, you can't do this because you have a duty of loyalty to me because we're partners. You can't do this behind my back. And this went to court, and the court said, yes, you have this duty of loyalty and a duty of care, and you backstab this guy, Cardozo said, and this fiduciary duty applies. So what they told them was that, okay, we're going to honor the original deal. So this guy Meinard is going to put up the money, to lease the whole block, all the rent payments, and you're going to manage this, and then you're going to split everything 50-50. And at first Salmon was furious, but this case was like in 1928, I think. And then you remember what happened in 1929, right?
The stock market crash.
Stock market crash, yeah. So if this guy had been stuck,
I remember, I was there.
yeah, he had been stuck leasing all this, he would have lost everything and been bankrupt. But this other guy had to pay the bill, and he was just managing it, and he was still getting paid during the entire Great Depression. So for the rest of his life, on the anniversary of that decision, he would send Justice Cardozo flowers. This is absolutely a true story.
I believe it.
Okay. Right. So yeah, he's got this duty of loyalty and a duty of care because he's a member of the board, and he can't strike a deal that's in favor of himself instead of somebody else. And there's another Delaware case, Sinclair Oil, where it was two companies. It was an oil company. One of these subsidiary deals where the subsidiary was 97% owned by the parent, and then 3% owned by this other guy. And they were running it for the parent corporation and paying out these exorbitant dividends and doing deals with the parent company that were at unfavorable terms. And Sinclair sued because you're double dealing with yourself, and you can't do that. And that's what the Delaware court said. Normally you have they give deference to the people running the company. They call it the business judgment rule.
I remember that.
Yeah, with judges, it's the rule of reasonableness, or however you want to say. It's not that you would make the same decision, but it's that somebody who's a normal person, making rational decisions could come up with that decision. That's the business judgment rule. But the higher standard is, I think they call it integral fairness with these self-dealing transactions. Or entire fairness. Sorry.
You've got to be careful. I mean,
yeah,
legally.
And the problem, if you violate this fiduciary duty, let's say he sold the company and he was part of the people that bought the company, right? So he's an 80% owner. He says, okay, me and the Saudis are going to buy out the other 20%. We've agreed on this price and you have to take it. Well, you don't have to take it because this is in Delaware, and the Delaware courts have seen this before. And what would happen if you squeeze out the minority shareholders, you better give them a good price, because afterwards the court can look at this under the entire fairness thing. And let's say they offered you $100 a share, right? It's 50 now, they offer you 100. The stock tanks, or not the stock tanks, the business does terribly. You keep your $100, right? But let's say the company does really well, and you say, you know what? I feel like I got screwed. I'm going to take them to court. And the judge says, yeah, you didn't get a fair deal. You need more money. So it sort of gives you this free option if they treat you unfairly, because you can keep the money if you're happy with it. And if the business does terribly, you get to keep your money. But if the business does really well, you can sue after and say, I didn't get a fair deal. And the way that you avoid that is you want to dot all your I's and cross all your T's. And there's something that they do, and this came out about 7 or 8 years ago, a case called, it was Khan. Yeah, it was dealing with this type of thing, a freeze out. So if you're a minority,
in this episode,
majority holder, go ahead.
I said there are a lot of cons in this episode. There's Nick Khan, Tony Khan.
Yeah, this is KAHN.
It's same.
If you're a majority shareholder and you're trying to take private or freeze out the minority shareholders, if you don't want the court to come in after the fact and look at this deal and decide if they got a fair shake and give them money, you have to do two things. And one is you have to get the independent directors to look at this and decide a fair price. So Vince couldn't be involved in this. He couldn't be involved in this at all. But the directors that are not loyalists, they would have to get together and they would hire, McKinsey or Bain and Company or somebody else to do a fairness opinion. And they would say, we think the price should be between here and here. And then after that, you put the vote to the shareholders. And then if a majority of the minority holders approve it, then, you're good. But if you don't get a majority of minority holders, you lost. And this happened with when Michael Dell tried to buy his company back. It was a public company. He wanted to take it private, but because he was an insider, he owned a lot of the stock and he was on the board. He couldn't participate in the negotiations where they hired the accounting firm and they came up with a fairness opinion, and they were dealing with private equity people. There were two groups of people that were bidding on this, and he couldn't even be involved in negotiations because one of the groups was him and his managers who wanted to take it private. And then there were other people who were interested in buying the whole company without him. And so, obviously there's a conflict. So the disinterested board has to handle that. He can't be involved.
I think this is really interesting because I don't know whether he could resist just as a matter of character. And I also, and he's getting good legal advice, but
Yeah.
I and others are convinced that, what he's looking for as part of any deal is to remain in control, and not even remain in control, to take control. Because right now he's come back into the company to oversee the sale, but he hasn't taken control of the product. Although you could say at this point, his son-in-law is probably not going to be doing much that he thinks Vince wouldn't approve of, because that might not be a great idea. Like there's just this self-censorship that's going to be going on among it. There's a lot of fear going on because, everyone thinks eventually he's going to take control again of the creative. And there's fear on a lot of ends, fear for the actual quality of the creative, and then obviously fear related to, like, you don't, as we brought up earlier, you want this guy making decisions relating to women? No, nobody does. He was ousted. He should have remained out, but he did not. I don't know. Did you have any other comments on the fiduciary duty that I think he's got to be very, very careful. I think is the main the gist from this is if he's focused on retaining power, I think he's opening himself up to some potential litigation that he'd lose. But is there anything else you wanted to add?
Right, for two reasons. One, if it was just a sale and he's selling the company to the Saudis or to Turner Broadcasting or whoever he wants, sure. But if he wants to stay involved, and he's kind of double dealing there, and he's got the duty of loyalty as a member of the board that he has to take into account. So if part of the deal involves a golden parachute for him and not the others, or involves some equity in the new company, then he's got this higher standard because he's not just getting the highest price for the shareholders. He's double dealing. He's on both sides of the deal.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of at least from the wrestling sites I've seen really have not covered that too extensively, and so I think that's some really important information that people aren't necessarily paying attention to. One other thing I did want to also point out was the relationship with the Saudis. I maybe give some background on that. As I mentioned, it's one of the big profitable areas for WWE. They get 2 shows a year in Saudi Arabia for about $50 million per show. I think it started in 2018, initially, and the reason they're getting paid so much is that as part of these shows, you get little videos talking about how progressive Saudi Arabia is.
Yeah.
There was a lot of pushback by fans against that, and there wasn't really any blowback really beyond that until Khashoggi was murdered. At which point, then there was some what's his name, the Nightly Show. Oh God, what's the comedian? What's his name? He did a segment on it that got some play, but there was
Right. Khashoggi, for those who don't know, was a Washington Post journalist who was murdered by the Saudi secret police in their embassy, was in their consulate. And they actually have a recording of
murdered
it.
and dismembered.
They tortured, murdered, and dismembered him. And it was all caught on tape, which is shocking. And as part of Saudi Arabia's attempt to clean up their image, they had a PGA golf tour where they overpaid everyone so that they would show up and say nice things about Saudi Arabia. They're overpaying probably WWE by a lot for you to show up, and it's the PR tour. And if you're wondering, well, how did they get this on tape? It happened in Turkey, and it turns out that the Turkish secret police had the whole embassy bugged because they like spying on people. And so at first there was speculation that I think they thought his iPhone had recorded it because there was a recording of him being tortured and murdered. And then, about a year later, it came out that no, actually the Turkish secret police had the whole consulate bugged, and they told the Americans, oh, they've murdered this Washington Post journalist, and the US didn't do anything about it because at the time, 45 said, well, we sell them a lot of jets and tanks and everything like that. We don't want to screw that up. So,
and with WWE, Vince is actually, won't even get into it.
Yeah.
So they continued that relationship. 2019, there was actually another big controversy where I guess Saudi Arabia owed some money to Vince on the deal, and I think Vince cut off the TV.
Yeah, he cut off the live feed, and then they wouldn't let the athletes leave. They off the plane, and they had
the wrestlers were kept
the military
hostage
guarding them, and until the WWE came back to the table and they squashed things.
And I should also point out, Vince left on his private plane with Brock Lesnar and a few others. But in any case, WWE denied that this happened. You had wrestlers' wives who were going nuts at the time because they were frightened, because they were in contact with their husbands who were being held hostage. The military was there, and they denied it heavily. But I also wanted to point out that there was a shareholder suit not related to this, but there was going to be discovery related to this, that WWE settled for $39 million in order to avoid discovery on this issue. So, I mean, this happened. It's, I don't want to say well documented because they've done a lot to try to deny it, try to avoid coming to terms with it. But yeah, there was a hostage situation, and you had wrestlers who said they were never going to return. You actually have a wrestler, Sami Zayn, who has a Syrian background, who Saudi Arabia has not allowed to perform on these shows. But that's the background that Vince is in bed with these guys. And so that's that. I think there's one more area we should probably cover before, and that's probably going in a complete circle, going back to the beginning, which is there was a shareholder who brought a suit based on Vince forcing his way back in, brought a suit, and it's a potential class action, arguing that Vince has deprived the board of its right to make these decisions, and that it violates Delaware law. I think Peter could probably explain more about the legal arguments there. But by Vince bringing back himself and his two cronies, he's depriving the board of its duty. I think that's the gist of the argument.
Right. So I haven't looked at the lawsuit, but I did see the press release. And in Delaware law, as I said, as a member of the board, you have a fiduciary duty to all your shareholders, not just the guy who appointed you or the CEO. And so I'm guessing as a majority shareholder, maybe he called an emergency meeting and then had these two new directors appointed because he has 81% of the votes. But there's a Delaware case, I'm blanking on the name, where there was an attempt to do a hostile takeover of a company, and the company didn't want to be taken over. And rather than do the usual poison pill measures like loading up with debt or different things, they actually packed the board. They think they had 5 people on the board, and they expanded the board to 9. They changed the bylaws, which would dilute the shareholder vote. And the Delaware court said, no, you can't do that because you're not allowed to deprive shareholders of their vote. You can do things if you're running the company that the shareholders may not agree with. And that's, as I said, if you don't want to sell it, you're allowed to do these defensive measures. But if it's for sale, you just get the highest price. But what you're not allowed to do is deprive the shareholders of their vote. And by diluting the board, you are taking away the shareholders' elected representatives of the right to vote. And that might be the basis of this suit, because Vince put 2 of his loyalists on, and I don't know if the other 2, one resigned, right? His daughter resigned. Did the other guy get kicked out, or what happened with that?
I'm sorry.
Well, his daughter resigned. Did the other
There,
one or 2 people resign who left the board?
there were 3 removed, and two more resigned, and then his daughter was a third who resigned. So altogether, you have 3 removals and 3 resignations.
Right.
The 3 resignations include Stephanie, which is his daughter, and the person who was leading the investigation into Vince. So, I mean, it's all really complicated, and I think it's. I obviously I can't comment. I haven't seen the lawsuit itself, but it seems viable based on what I'm hearing from you, and I mean just the way you went about this.
As I said, as a shareholder, he's got no duty to anyone but himself. But once you're a board member, that changes. And if you put yourself on the board and then you nominated 2 other cronies to keep these allegations against you from becoming public, or to entrench yourself in power, that doesn't benefit the other shareholders or the corporation. So there's that duty of loyalty, duty of care thing, right?
There is, but I mean, I'm not certain that it's an aspect of this suit, since I guess the actual action he took was before he ended up back on the board, and I think that's what they're aimed at. And I think
right. I have to look at the lawsuit, but
so I think what it's saying is that by doing this, whether you had a fiduciary duty or not, you are depriving the board of its right to make these calls, and you can't do that under Delaware law, whether you have a duty of care or not. I think that's the basis of the suit. And again, I can't speak to how viable it is. I mean, it sounds like it should be viable. That when I said to you, I even asked you the other day whether when he said, "Oh, you know what? I'm not going to give my approval to any sale or any media rights deal." Like, okay, yeah, okay. Granted, he's the majority shareholder, and if he's not on the board, he doesn't have a duty. But I'm like, I still don't know that he can do that. I mean, and that's why I asked you. I don't know, but it all sounds a little like he might be getting into legal murky waters, but we'll see how that plays out too. I mean, this is a constantly evolving story. They denied that the rumor was that the sale had taken place, that Saudi Arabia had actually bought it, and they denied it. I think that's still a strong possibility, because there you'd have the ability to go private again, which is something I think he wants to do. And Saudi Arabia obviously would have no issues with him morally being in charge of this thing. Like, we don't like how you treated women. I don't think that that's going to be the crown prince's problem here. So I think Vince would have no problem from the ownership perspective, just sliding right back into total control of the product, which is exactly what he wants. And I think, what is known is that he's been working on this deal with Saudi Arabia this entire time. Like, this is what he's been trying to do. I think it is his goal, and I think it's probably, from his perspective, like the best possible outcome.
Yeah, and it should be said that even though the CIA determined that the king of Saudi Arabia had ordered this journalist murdered, and even though it's on tape, with these Saudis, special agents that flew to Turkey and tortured and killed this guy, and it's all on tape. The king of Saudi Arabia, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he denies it that he had any involvement.
Crown Prince, or
sorry, I think it was the prince. Yeah. And I'm blanking on his name. I think it's Mohammed bin Salman, right? But he denies any involvement. He says, I had no idea they were going to do this. And to prove I had no idea, I'm going to prosecute the people that did this. So he put 9 of the people on trial. They were sentenced to death, and then they were all pardoned. So
I think he's clearly innocent of we should certainly not be defaming his name here.
yeah, you shouldn't defame a billionaire who has secret police who allegedly murder people in other countries.
Probably beyond the billionaire, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, I think this went kind of long, but at least the sound we're not going to get any complaints about. I got this.
hopefully not.
All you guys complaining about the sound, I got that's for you, right?
I'm still in my attire that's getting some comments. I'm a slob.
Yes, we couldn't get you out of that, but
Homeless. I'm homeless. Get him a shirt.
I
He looks
did
like a
get this
homeless
for the
guy.
show. Look, I got a little.
A little gavel.
Yes,
That's a gavel you can pound when I'm interrupting.
there you go. See, there.
I've got a bigger gavel.
Well, it's not the size of it. It's as if you know how to bang. How you wield it, Dave.
All right.
All that. You know what? I think this is like almost, it went pretty long, but this is almost an episode where we didn't make a dick joke, but
You can't. Come on, I have to.
so close.
It really was. All right. I thank you for doing this episode. I know it was my little pet project. I hope people like it. And I think they may actually listen to it because, geez, it's in the news. It became, I don't know. We lucked out with this timing. I think it's serendipitous for sure. Like we definitely had no idea any of this was coming up when, what was it, 10, 11 days ago, we're like, hey, we're doing a Vince episode next week. And then, 2 days before we're planning to record, I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah, and it's a fast changing story. Like things keep coming out every day. So who knows what's going to happen next week, but the story is evolving. So
Hey, any questions, please just put it in the comments, and maybe we'll do a little follow up if there are any extensive questions.
yeah, that's right. Like and subscribe, but also put any questions you have in the comments. And if you notice, I'm not wearing glasses today because I wasn't reading anything. So all this corporate stuff, even though I haven't practiced corporate law for 20 years, it's still in there somewhere.
I think there's a glare on the glasses too, like when you're wearing them. So it's probably better not to. I don't think anyone's actually commented yet, but since we fixed the audio issues, if you're wearing your glasses, you may have had a comment or two about that.
Yeah, they'll always find something to complain
Yeah,
about.
of course.
They're still complaining about your t-shirt.
I was called both. He looks homeless, and then I had some Karen. Actually, her name was Barbara, going off about calling me a slob. I actually, like, regardless. I mean, you could think whatever you want about me, but like, I actually wonder about people who make comments like that. Like, what drives you to have to say something like that? Like, why?
Well, there was one that I thought was really funny, and you thought it was funny too, where the guy said, if I was on a jury where he
I convict him. That was great. That's a great comment.
He said I would convict him, and I thought it was funny because like it didn't even say what you were accused of.
Like no matter what
you were accused of.
I don't need any evidence.
Yeah. And so then I linked to the episode where you talked about your past and like your felony conviction and everything like that. And then he deleted the comment and said, I think
I was his favorite YouTuber.
You're awesome. I love you.
You're my favorite YouTuber now.
Yeah. So we laughed at the first comment. Like we didn't take it personally.
No, Barbara was vicious though. Who dresses like that? Slob. Exclamation point. I mean, geez. Seriously. Hurt someone's feelings.
You know what? If the judge could see you now, he'd be rolling over.
Oh,
in his
he'd be
grave.
shocked. He'd be horrified.
All right. So let's wrap this episode up,
All right.
and I'll
Yeah,
try
I
to
hope
get
people
it up
enjoy it.
as soon as possible, and I'll try to edit out the part where Cookie Monster interrupted. and was
Yeah, that'd be cool.
crying and whining.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
All right.
Thanks
Good
a lot.
talking to you, man.
Take care. Bye-bye.